Welcome to Quoggling Sand. This is the very first episode. The title hopefully will give you the sense of what's happening. Building stuff is what I'm intending to talk about often, not always. But of course, the very first episode of this new podcast, that's one of the things I got to do. Let's talk about it. So, first of all, I will say I would much rather have guests and or a live stream with interaction. Probably not going to get very far if I'm talking to a microphone and by extension myself. So look for that in the near future. Yes, I will tell you what Quoggling Sand means. But first things first, this is the third podcast show that I've become a part of, so to speak. 2 by myself so far, and 1 called Hugo Floss, which you can jump in on and check out for yourself. Not just me talking to myself. You can hear my voice is a little scratchy. It's getting better, believe it or not. The allergy scene in Las Vegas is always a challenge. It didn't die down as it normally does. Although I just realized yesterday that we're just about getting into allergy season once again. So I don't even remember at this point. Not only is it 1 year into the great pandemic, but it's, for me, 1 year of ridiculous allergy. So I will probably have a day or so of nice voice. And I know it doesn't sound like it, but it might get worse. Anyway, Quoggling Sand. Let's just get that off the table right now. But I'm sure I'll mention it each episode just because. Quoggling Sand literally was the term that I came up with when I was, I don't know, say 4 years old, to describe what today a reasonable person might recall referring to as pins and needles, or what is the pins and needles is the big one. Numbness, right? Circulation returning to my limb, whichever it is. So I have pins and needles. Those are things that you are probably familiar with. But for some reason, when I was very young, I decided to call it Quoggling Sand. That's what I envisioned. That's what I termed it. And here we are. So creative thinking sometimes maybe will also come up in this show per episode. So one of the things I have been looking into as part of this new podcasting adventure, which, by the way, I will say, and I will talk about this more later, this is not my first foray into podcasting. When I was very, very bored, I suppose, in Silicon Valley, as the world was winding down, getting tired of .com craziness the first time. I took a leadership Sunnyvale class. Many cities have these. It's basically, here's how our city functions. Met some interesting people. It came to our attention that there was no local media in the city of Sunnyvale, which was, despite the marketing, kind of in the middle of Silicon Valley. It's probably moved to more like Menlo Park. But at the time, Mountain View, San Jose, some parts of Milpitas, there were a lot of things. So, Sunnyvale was kind of closer to the middle, certainly geographically, maybe not culturally. But anyway, so for a city at the time of something like 120,000 people, there was no local paper. There was the Sunnyvale Sun, I think, which was published by Dan Polcrano, which was part of Sidewalk Media, which eventually got sold to the San Jose Mercury. There was no local radio and TV, of course. There was no local reporting. So it had a small town feel with what was at the time the largest population on the peninsula, if you don't count San Francisco and San Jose. And who does? So big, small city or small, big city or something. And without any media, is basically, it was whatever you heard at the local coffee shop or at the city council meeting, or I think they had a public access window for city council meetings. But otherwise, it was very, I heard it from so-and-so. I was talking to somebody. I, eventually blog posts or some online content. There was no Facebook at the time. This was back in, say, 2010, 2012. So not that there was no Facebook, but there was not like it is now. So, there was some social media. And so one of my classmates of the leadership program and I formed Radio Sunnyvale, that's probably an entire podcast on its own. But we started recording various shows. I had Doing Business in Sunnyvale. We had, I think it was Dan and Kevin, like a weekend, what's going on? And there was certainly this is pre-live stream, live podcast. There was no, I don't even know, was there Skype back then? I can't remember. But certainly the use of easily accessible tools to create live, guest-oriented, chat-enabled shows like this it was beyond the reach of the casual, inventive character, even in Silicon Valley. So at the time, we had these, we would do our shows, and we would talk to people on the street, and they would usually ask which one, hey, are you Dan or Kevin? So we did have listeners that we could interact with in the good old-fashioned way. But we did not have, say, for example, when I interviewed one of the mayoral candidates, was it? I think she was running for mayor at the time. She was a city council member, and they elect a mayor from within the council in Sunnyvale. So we met at a coffee shop, and beforehand, I had people call. I think I had Vonage Voice at the time, so I set up a virtual phone number with a voicemail box that people could call in and ask questions, and so I would play the questions during the show. When we were recording it, I had my Zoom recorder, and the candidate responded. So that was a workaround. It was kind of cool, but today you can stream 4K video from your phone and all kinds of craziness. So anything's possible. Anyway, so Quoggling Sand, my goal with this, first of all, I'll say I have the two other shows. Hugo Floss is actually with my mom. Before you say anything, my mom has been more recently podcasting for years. And so this is more, it kind of grew out of our pandemic phone discussions. And why would I call my home every day? Well, let's just say my dad has seen better days. So daily updates and whatnot. He's doing fine, by the way, relatively fine. So, yeah, we said, hey, why not? What else are we doing on a Sunday midday? So we've been recording every Sunday for the last, I want to say 15 weeks. And then I had also at the same time started what I call FFS, which is the show with some structure to it. The idea is to discuss what works and what does not. Constructive discussion, I hope, and to see what we can do about what doesn't work and how can we make it into what does work. So I did a couple of shows. It was around the holidays, New Year, and then I took a little break. We've been doing our Hugo Floss show weekly, and then I just got back to FFS last week. So the main reason I want to do some of these shows and kind of get my production workflow and the ability to organize show notes and publish properly and get a wide net cast to be found is because I actually have projects, which I will discuss here casually, but various things should have a media engagement component, so to speak, if I can throw some buzzwords around. So, some jargon. So, I would like to be able to engage, talk to, reach out to, share with people that are part of or are interested in. Man, that's a lot of commas. To just interact with people about projects that are like Worky, which is my project for what comes next after a smart desk that goes up and down. So no time like after spending 1 year working from home or trying to learn from home if you're a student. Who is not trying to learn from home either way? So what do we need? A desk that moves up and down, of course. No. So Worky was something I came up with several years ago, 4 years ago at CES. So maybe we'll say 3.5 years ago. I was at CES at the time. I was attending a dinner that was put on by Hackster.io. I can't remember if this was before they were purchased. Anyway, so Adam and the crew put on this dinner here in Vegas, and so I attended, and I'll drop some names: Eric Pan, Massimo Banzi, Fabio Violente. Sorry, Fabio. Like you're listening. A host of other people that I didn't know as well. So Eric from Seed, Massimo, and Fabio from, did I say Massimo? Massimo Banzi. From Arduino, Adam from Hackster, of course, and a few other people, various people I kind of knew or knew better. Anyway, so we had this discussion. Well, I had been on the show floor. I saw a sea of standing desks. That was the year of standing desks being like a tier 0 attraction on the main floor. And I actually visited the autonomous.ai booth. And I said, these are very nice desks that go up and down. Yes. So autonomous AI, I said, well, what's the AI part? And they had an entire different product range aiming at like an AI tower or something, some compute service that you would, a local compute service. So you'd have it somewhere in your office or home or whatever. And so I'm guessing somebody pivoted somewhere and they switched to smart furniture, smart desks, and then the leaning stools. And so anyway, so the take home was I said, you guys, seems like there's some more possibility here. And I tried to get them on board with a professional or boutique, I guess, or a small, like a focused private hackathon concept. I was fresh out of Intel at the time. So I said, hey, you guys should have like a smart desk hackathon and see what comes next after the up and down buttons. You know, what can people do with your autonomous.ai smart desks? Water break. So it was hit or miss trying to communicate with them, and they were going through kind of a reorg, so I let that sit. But end of the day, we've all spent 1 year in various states of lockdown, working from home, or trying to come up with creative ways to work in an office that is now mini quarantine pods, or however you're facing your new work life. The work-life balance has been out of whack. So this seems like a perfect time to jump back into that. So that's one project, and very clearly, oh, by the way, open source project. It's not a product project. It's more of a community, trying to get the hacker maker communities to focus a little bit on that specific area. And then it's a way to reach out to business and companies, Steelcase or IKEA or some other, I'm trying to think off the top of my head. There are various, I come across smart desk companies all the time, or IKEA obviously makes various pieces of furniture. They do not make the jerker anymore. Shout out to the jerker and anyone who was lucky enough to keep one of those or find one and use it. A very simple desk, but sometimes that's a good starting point. So the Worky project, and then that will eventually fall under what we hope will be a nonprofit venture called Casa Nunzia, which was inspired by Casa Jasmina in Italy. I met with the founders and the main lead organizer of that, Davide Gumba, when I was visiting the Arduino offices in Torino. So couple that with some discussions I had while I was at CES for Intel about the Intel dress designed by Anouk Whiprecht. I'm sure I just said her name wrong, sorry. My voice is fighting with me right now. So that was a technology based on the smart dress, on biometrics and system response to biometric changes. That's another story entirely. If I can get Anouk on here someday, we can talk about that. But the idea was, hey, why don't we have a whole home that interacts with you? And between then and now, of course, everything is a smart speaker. And Hue Lighting and various other lighting companies, and obviously cameras pointing at everything, and then Amazon buying them up. So the notion of a smart home has been driven in the direction of voice command and video display. If you have an Amazon product with a screen, or a Google or a Facebook now products, and obviously speakers and microphones and video cameras, and the list goes on from there, although those are the big ones. So the concept that I brewed up while I was there at CES having this discussion, I said, it'd be interesting if people could develop products and then have actual users use them, but not just have normal. I don't want to say normal. That's not it. But what the product development people call a normal customer is usually someone who doesn't have an accent, or doesn't have a speech impediment, or doesn't have limited speech capabilities, or doesn't have various other human features to interact with that are outside of what we'll call the 80% norm, right? So the concept that we bounced around was, well, what if you could live in a workspace, the hackable apartment, that was Casa Jasmina. What if you had a hackable apartment, but the devices in the apartment were all of these different types of smart home devices we see now, and then new devices that were under development. If you've ever been to CES and you go to the Eureka Park section, where all the startups have their 10 by 10 or smaller 5 by 5 booths, that's the person starting the company with their co-founders and first employees, or they're 3 or 4 people, if that. And these are people that may be coming up with the next ridiculously cool, useful, certainly viable thing. And then how can they jump into the fray and make products that will work in a smart home environment? So Casa Nunzia, make that a smart home incubation environment, I guess. But what about people outside of that 80% norm? What about, how do we make a smart speaker that's better for people who can't speak as clearly as I am right now? What about people that have special considerations, special needs? And I said, well, what if we could make smart home technologies for people who actually need them? Now, I personally don't need any smart speakers. I've been getting through my days perfectly fine without. But certainly there are people who are not completely ambulatory, do not have complete use of all of their limbs or dexterous use of them. So the ability to using a voice command, check who's at the door, or turn on the water for a bath, or turn on a cooking appliance. Check on is my coffee ready? The sky's the limit. So the idea is I am not supposed to think of all those possibilities. The people that need that should be a part of that. So if you look at the entire co-creation movement, which is the business version of makers, right? How do we make smart home technology move with the aid of co-creation, working with people who need, not just want, but need these technologies? So it occurred to me at some point, I live in Nevada, I live in Las Vegas proper, city of. If you're on the Strip, you're not in the city of Las Vegas. So that's why I point that out sometimes. Just an oddity. But I live here, and there's actually a certain VA presence. So I was attending the KBIS IBS show 2 years ago. Yeah, it's 2019. And I attended a living in place meeting for if you live in your home for more than a few years, I guess, and then you begin to, you're aging. Usually, it used to be called aging in place. As you live in place, you suddenly find yourself needing grab bars, or maybe that step is a little bit too high for the hip. The list goes on. So they focus on that area, and I went, okay, interesting. And as it happens, there was somebody in the special needs housing group from the VA, the Veterans Administration from the VA in DC as part of this. So I had a nice chat with him. We connected on LinkedIn, and this year was not so good for meetups, but I did speak to him the year after in 2020 at CES. And this was in January, so everything sort of went south February, March, and here we are today. But we left things at, hey, we should talk about maybe a grant proposal or something. So that the idea would be, hey, what if we created this infrastructure? Now, I'm not saying I want to go set up these living spaces, but there are people who do work with the VA to set up living spaces. So we had an infrastructure in place to not only honor privacy and dignity of various people using, trying, testing, working with, co-creating these technologies and the devices and the workflows and what works, what doesn't. So if we came up with that infrastructure and we had support in some way from the VA, well, the VA has an entire infrastructure to, well, whether you like it or not, that's another discussion. But they have an infrastructure in place, and they have people to work with. And so our discussion was optimistic. So we'll see if I can get that going somewhere. So Worky is a subset of that. That's how can I enable a workspace or a work surface that's not a desk that moves up and down? What about other interactions? What about other technologies? What about cameras and touch sensors and microphones? But also, how can we take these technologies and, much like you would at a hackathon, modular technologies from companies like Seed and M5 Stacks and Raspberry Pi now is a big one, and the list is only growing. All of these pieces are available, much like Legos. And I always used to say at hackathons, it's like you throw some Legos out on a table and just see what you can come up with. So Worky to focus on workspace, workplace, work surface, and turning notions into tangible projects and products eventually in an open source realm, but make that a part of the Casa Nunzia nonprofit venture to connect the big companies, the small companies. And by the way, when we were at the Living in Place meetup, the discussion was, how do you feed back information to a company like Amazon, or the Lab 126 people, I guess, or Google or IKEA. How do you gather and aggregate the feedback for special needs applications and turn what you're learning in the field into an iterative product development and improvement cycle? And they didn't really know. So I'm not saying that's bad. I'm just saying it's not that there is nothing that I'm aware of aimed at this. And so, well, there will be. So those are two projects. There are a few other things, but those are probably the most visible in the near term, and they will both have some online discussion components. So I'd like to have podcast and or video, probably video at some point. There will certainly be things to see, demonstrations and working discussions, hackathons perhaps, almost definitely. So why not get back into podcasting, right? So of course, here we are. So in addition, I am right now exploring some live stream options and opportunities that are presenting themselves now that Clubhouse has made people say, "Oh, look at that! People like to talk in audio form and publish it." Brand new idea. So I think it was yesterday or the 19th, maybe March 19th. Telegram put out a blog post about a feature that they have massaged into a more open public implementation of chatting, voice chatting, recordable, infinite participation, listeners, I guess, guests, basically, as with everybody else, jumping into the Clubhouse fray. But the nice thing about Telegram is a lot of open source software, cross-platform support. You don't have to say you must be a Twitter user, you must be a Facebook user, you must have an iPhone. So call me crazy, this open source thing, I think it's going to catch on. I really do. So that's sort of informing my views on how Worky and Casa Ninja should work. Silos do not usually make the best innovation happen. So there's all those things. And then on top of all that, there's my solopreneur day-to-day in general. And who is not tired of sitting at home avoiding the sick, which I've managed to do. Although, by the way, I will say I did get both Moderna shots. The second one was in February, so just over a month ago. So I'm fully vaccinated, never had any major side effects. So these are things that I can mention. We can have like just random chats. I have a FFS talk episode about vaccination. I did volunteer at a vaccination pod, so I had some anecdotes about, I was one person at one spot, but some interesting things. So there's an entire set of topics to talk about there, but here it could just be whatever comes to mind. Even better if and when I can enlist the insights and opinions and thoughts and views of guests and participants in general. So I say so a lot. I'll apologize now. So my voice, you can hear, is wimping out a little bit. I'm going to grab some more water. It started off as hot water, no longer. So I got to stop doing that. That'll be one of my goals for this whole entire episode and podcast. Because it's more casual, I don't really have a script or an agenda or a set of bullets. So a stream of consciousness, I have a lot of sewing in there. Another thing that I would like to include, and this will almost definitely benefit from other discussion, is a sort of what are you working on? And because a 1 year plus into staying home, growing my potatoes as as did Matt Damon in The Martian, and not really interacting with people so much. I have avoided being sick. I spoke on the phone with my parents quite a bit. That yielded a different podcast. And I have all these projects to work on. And so without a team or weekly meeting or some structure, it is not quite as easy to make measurable progress in a way that drives that progress. So what I'm getting at is I need to have a way to set goals that I can try to stick to. So if I'm going to tell you, hi there, if I'm going to tell you about my progress for the week, then I should have some. And so the notion of weekly sprints is something I've been trying to get myself to do. I was part of an incubator with a startup idea that my alma mater, Harvey Mudd College, does, I believe, it once a year. Maybe it was twice, but I was in the summer cohort, and it was free. If you're a graduate, come on down. It was all virtual. And unfortunately, my non-technical co-founder was not able to participate. So it was basically just me as an experiment. And I suggested to our pod that we have weekly sprints as a way to sort of keep forward motion and have something to talk about on Mondays. So spend the week. And then I think we had Friday casual meetups and a speaker. Somebody would speak about VC or their experiences as a startup founder and all that. And then we'd break up into these pods. And then Monday was a more structured, here's what's up this week kind of thing. So I said we should have like a Monday through Friday sprint and then a weekend sprint. And it's sort of like when you go to the gym, it's always nice to have somebody else there who can spot you. Hey, what do you think of this idea? Hey, can you look at my code? Hey, I need to talk about something other than this project for 10 minutes. Whatever, just to know that other people are working remotely. I saw some value in that. And I was alone in that assumption. So I'm going to try driving that by myself here, and we'll see where that goes. But I would obviously like to start some sort of a open forum of here's what I'm working on in my sprint. And that fits into the co-creation model that I've already talked about, and it fits into eventually worky projects and Casa Nunzia. Those would be bigger projects and probably more substantial in their output. And finally, I have endless stories, and I have no outlet. By that, I mean I have... I worked in Silicon Valley for 13 years, I think it was, with a window in the middle there. And I lived in Phoenix for 5 years, between 2001 and 2005. And so I got to see Silicon Valley from the dot-com era, from 93, when I moved to Sunnyvale. 2001, when I left, in August of 2001. So things changed substantially about a month later. And then when I moved back to Silicon Valley in 2005, and then I moved to Las Vegas after a house fire in 2012. So there's all kinds of stuff to kind of reflect on. And I have told people my CV, my resume has a lot of stuff on it. Some people say it's too long, but I always say I'm kind of the product of all these things. So it's the digital age. You're not getting a stack of paper. You can certainly search through and see what you like, and I can write you a cover letter that focuses some things. But I will say, my first job out of college was for a company called Supermac, and I was taking benchmark data from competitor graphic cards. At the time, it was Radius. And these were new bus Macintosh video cards, right? So back in the day, SuperMac focused on desktop publishing. So dye sublimation printers, color profiled monitors, color profiled workflows for publishing. So I learned a bunch of stuff, color space conversions, QA process, the beginnings of it, right? Because you want to take measurements on machines that you know what's running. You can't have someone go steal the memory out of your Quadra and then say, oh, I guess suddenly my benchmarks are different, and not question what happened, right? So it was a good introduction to how the workaday world was working. I was in Silicon Valley. It was in a former NSA building near Moffett Field on the Sunnyvale side. And yeah, it was an interesting experience. I only worked there from July of 93 to October. And then there were layoffs, and that was my another educational experience. And as it turns out, the person that made the thumb up or down decision on my being laid off or remaining as a highly paid hourly employee, I think it was 15 an hour. Today's minimum wage, but in 1993, crazy. The person that decided whether I would stay or go, Lou Doctor, would eventually be the CEO of True Vision, where I would eventually become an employee. And so the circles of Silicon Valley were small, and sometimes, well, we'll just say they were small. So there was a lot of stuff to learn during the craziness that was the dot-com era. And for better or worse, it was possible to get a job in Silicon Valley if you had a heartbeat and a pen. This is back in the answering machine days. There was more than one occasion where I would return home from work, blinking light, and there was headhunters and recruiters and whatever leaving me messages. My favorite at one point was somebody literally scheduled my interview, and all I would have to do is just show up. I don't even have to say whether I'm interested or not. I just have to go and show up. And if I don't show up, well, that's fine too. So it was such a demand for warm bodies that probably led us to where we are today. But at the time, as it turns out, I never, except for one particular case, I never actually worked for a .com, and I never really worked for a software company, not counting Netscape. But I'll just give a quick rundown from memory. I'll make a list, and because I would like to, there are each of these roles has a story or 10 or 20, so I'm sure I will bring them up at some point. So after True Vision, I got laid off at True Vision. I started working for Storm Technologies for 2 weeks as a temp contractor QA person. So this sent me down the QA path, quality assurance. A person named Dave Duran, whom I had met at SuperMac, gave my resume to his friend, Linda Adams, or possibly Jess Gibson at Apple. I got an interview there, and Jess Gibson gave me a phone call shortly after, and I got an offer to work for, I want to say it was like $22 an hour as a contractor in Apple Quality in Mariani 1 on the Power Macs. Remember those? So the Power PC was coming online, and I would be I would be a QA tester. I would be testing application compatibility on the PowerPC upgrade card. Back when PowerPC 601 was just coming on the scene. And tons of things happened as a result of me working at Apple. Lots of meeting people, and that was a real education about how the world works. It was when Spindler, I believe, was there. all kinds of crazy things. So to be able to work at Apple at the time, I was a big Apple fanboy. My first computer was an Apple IIe. I always wanted a Macintosh, et cetera, et cetera. So for me, working at Apple was like, oh, this is why I became an engineer and went to college and all that. Even though I was a QA engineer. Now I will say, at the time, people looked down on testers. They were just testers. You were pigeonholed as a tester. That's all you would ever be, as a tester, a tester, a tester. And I look back at that time now as one of the most educational periods of my professional post-college life. And this is a topic I will happily discuss at length anytime, is how products are developed and what attention is paid to the actual users of the product. And I have discovered in my travels that people who are designing things don't often take into account what their users' needs or wants. Do those sound familiar? What do people really need? How are they going to use these products? And I have literally encountered in my continued professional life real professional, experienced engineering designers, managers. Why would someone want to do, fill in the blank? And if the answer is as simple as because it says we do that in the spec or in the documentation, or it could be as complicated as, well, I'm working with someone who is trying to do that, so we don't have to ask why, we have to ask how to enable. So in my travels, too many anecdotes to name here to list off here, but and this is obviously informing some of my views on the Casa Nunzia project, which I've already mentioned, is too often the insight that is going into design is coming from inspiration in a cubicle, not the world. So my QA experience at Apple was the first eye-opener. And it wasn't because of what I was learning by being a tester. It was what I was learning when I would find a problem and speak to an engineer who was almost certainly in a cubicle. And I learned the globally famous, it works on my machine. That was my favorite. So what I came away with from Apple was how to deal with the machinery of disjoint development of products. World famous products eventually, right? And along the way I met various characters that would be involved with the iPhone, and I was in the buildings where the iPhone would happen. I worked in the Newton Group later, several years later, as I returned as a contractor to Apple. So interesting times. And of course, Apple on your resume was one of those check boxes. So moving around Silicon Valley after my, we'll say it's a third job. It was the second real job. It wasn't a 2-week contract. But I did, when I worked at Storm Technologies, I did meet some people. So that was not useless time. So I count it. I worked with a person named Alt Mundane. That right there is enough. I should have that noted somewhere. After I left Apple, I went to UMax. No, sorry. Not true. I went to True Vision, which was formerly Rasterops. Rasterops was a competitor to Supermac. They also made graphic cards, video acceleration hardware. They merged with True Vision in Indiana. So I worked in the Silicon Valley office and we did video capture. And I have to say that was also very educational. We don't even have to begin to go down the video path, but let's just say everybody does video now. And at the time, well, when I look back at what we had to do to get NTSC or PAL video without dropping frames versus a 4K video capture in your phone, it boggles the mind. So that's an entire discussion. But that's where I met Chris Kapner. And I have reached out to Chris Kapner recently, and I said, I'm gonna somehow tell stories about all these things that I've learned along the way. And Chris was the director of engineering at the time. I would later run into him at the Newton Group when I was working with this software developer kit for C++ on a Newton, which I don't even know if that saw the light of day, on the MessagePad 2000. And I saw, hey, Chris, how you doing? I haven't seen you forever. And then when I worked at Palm on the pre, Chris was the battery guy. He was the battery expert developing the charging and power management circuitry. Some interesting discussions and times at Palm. So maybe I'll get Chris to join in here. Who knows? But maybe he'll listen. That'll be enough. So I've already dropped a few hints about the list. So True Vision, left True Vision to work at... Where did I go work at from there? Oh, at the Newton. I went to the Newton group after that. So I went and worked on the Newton software tools. And then when I left the Newton group, I worked at SCM Microsystems, which was a German company. The cool people were from Erfurt. The business people were from Munich. Learned a ton about ISO 7816 smart cards. But also learned a ton about having a company founded in a different culture than the one that was festering in Silicon Valley. So interesting time there. I had an opportunity to join Netscape because Netscape was very interested in smart cards at the time. So my college friend, Dave Carlton, was moving on to other things, and there was a chair open in the core technologies group doing security coding. Actually, he was moving internally. He moved to the Java team. So there was a chair, became available. I started working there. I ended up working with Brendan Ike and Jeff Winter and Jamie Zwinsky and Lisa Repka and Jeff and Eric Weinstein. Eric Weinstein? No. That's a different person. No, Tom. Eric Weinstein, that's a mathematician. That's another discussion entirely. Tom and Jeff Weinstein work there, and Dan Weinstein worked there like a summer or a short-term gig. And I was sitting in a cubicle with Tom Dell, who was the co-founder of Rotten.com. You may remember that one. And our manager, Jeff, and I said, hey, there's a Weinstein for each of us, Dan, Jeff, Tom. So, haha. But all kinds of interesting and educational times while I was at Netscape. Eventually left there to try my hand at joining a pre-IPO startup in UMax, where I learned 10 times as much, but they never went public. Eventually, the company was being shut down. I ended up at Philips working on flat displays and embedded and 8051 programming and traveling to Eindhoven and learning about working for one of the larger companies in the electronic space, Philips Electronics. Eventually left Philips to go to a 4-person startup started by the director of engineering from UMax and my college roommate, Kevin. And when that kind of was going off into the weeds, I took a position at Leapfrog and was working on educational toys. And then eventually, after Leapfrog, I moved to Phoenix. And then 9/11 happened. And then I moved back to Silicon Valley to work at Salon.com, which is the only .com I ever worked for, the magazine. Anyway, I'll leave it there because there are several more positions, and then there are a lot of stories to tell on the way. And that is where having smartwatches and phones and whatnot is it's always a distraction. It's like having a child and a puppy fighting. Anyway, that is Quoggling Sand. So into the future, I hope to try Telegram channels. Discord also would work, but ideally a side project. Everything's a side project or priority 0. Either way. I'm very interested in the Matrix project, Synapse or other I think they have that's a Python, and then I think they have a Go-based server and the Element client or web-based client. So chatting and voice with Jitsi video. So voice, video, chat, live stream, all open source, self-hosted, bridging to Telegram and other platforms. So it's kind of the big giant Victorinox pocket knife. And by the way, fun fact, I once got into an argument with Dave Bowers, who sat one cube over in Mariani 1 when I was working on the third floor there at Apple. And he was convinced and made sure that I should know better that it was Vitrino, to pronounce the famous Swiss Army knife company. So I reached out to the company and asked them to give me a pronunciation guide, and it turns out, just for trivia, it is actually not Vitrino. It is named after Queen Victoria and something else, which I do not remember at this moment since I didn't plan on referring to this. But Victorinox was the way that they pronounced it, or told me to. So there you go. The truth is out there. All we have to do is find it. But what I would like to do is have my own production platform for live stream, chat, whatever. And yeah, we can stream it over to YouTube, or we can stream it to a Telegram, or we can stream it to somewhere else. I would like to be able to use Zoom if needed, or YouTube live streams or whatever, but to not have to rely on third parties for all of the tools and hosting and streaming and broadcast and sharing and all that, because there are just too many cases where things don't work, or where things get shut down, or yeah, who knows. So that's one of my projects, but this week I will draw a line in the sand for the one person that probably finds this podcast initially. I have an entire platform for building ideas on top of. So not WordPress, not Django, sort of somewhere in between there, right? So they say don't build another CMS. So it's not quite that, but it is an integration of a database schema structure and a services architecture, whether it's micro or monolithic, trying to tackle both. And it's really, the inspiration comes from the need to be a solopreneur and not have, 3 or 4 people hanging out with a whiteboard nearby to say, hey, okay, what about if we fill in the blank, right? So without those things, I've spent far too long fiddling with various pieces of software, informed not only by my Super Mac experiences all the way up until my time at Intel, which I'll get to another time, but my foray into the mobile vending space and how people who like food trucks and farmers markets find and book, and how much those people are paying, and the formation of nonprofit owners associations and software tools and engagement with city and business. And there's all kinds of things that have prompted the need for a nice, flexible prototype to production software platform. And in the interim, since I first kind of started hacking away at this stuff, when jQuery mobile was like the thing, now, Amazon Cloud, AWS, Azure is coming on strong, Google Compute, and any number of smaller services, and not to mention the ridiculous explosion in software tools, and microservice methodology has become the most loved and hated technology around, or design paradigm around. YouTube has become the end-all and be-all for some, and the bane of others. I'm kind of in the middle. And so my goal is to take the Terraform infrastructure as code deployment that I had hacked together when they were still at version, I want to say 0.11 Terraform, and my first versions of all of my various code, which was still written in Python 2.7, that has been migrated to 3. Whatever, latest. And the HTML templates that I have for starting with Bootstrap, all using Chameleon, which used to be, or is a compatibility implementation of ZPT, so page templates. So all this stuff and all these pieces, and I have, much like Legos, splayed across my work table, which does not go up or down, by the way. It goes neither up nor down. Permanently set at my favorite height. But all these pieces, I need to get them integrated into a launchable state for some of the ideas that I have cooking, which I have not even begun to touch on. So today, the line in the sand, so to speak, is by Friday. So what would that be? 26 March, to have deployed the websites for the podcasts, Hugo Floss, FFS Talk, Quoggling Sand. Not only have the working RSS feeds for those, but so I don't have to rely on Anchor, although I will still publish on Anchor for the fan out. But the creation and launch of functional websites for the podcast seems like low-hanging fruit, and it would be if I were to change gears and just literally throw up some WordPress sites. But not a fan of WordPress, not a fan of PHP, and that is a salon story for another time. I spent a lot of time learning about database design and architecting this stack that I have developed, and there's probably value in getting that working in real life. It has worked. It has been launched and for other things over the years since little pieces of it here and there have come together. But this is about integrating the modern versions of what I've just described and then using those to deploy not only a podcast website with the usual features, but possibly that Jitsi Synapse integration for self-hosted live, certainly chat or streaming, possibly integrating with Telegram or other services, and then eventually launching things like Worky, which sounds like it would just be a blog plus GitHub or GitLab or similar. But certainly there's plenty of room for tying together projects through the Worky portal to IoT cloud services or Jupyter notebooks or things like that. So there are too many technologies floating around to, as a software architect myself, think that WordPress is sufficient. It might be necessary for the greater internet, but I'm trying to be a cook, and I don't want to go and buy a jar of tomato sauce and a box of cake mix, so to speak, right? So turning my code into working projects is on the menu, and my sprint goal for the week is to deploy websites using my deployment and infrastructure deployment stack and my so that's service instantiation and provisioning and software deployment. So Terraform plus I have shell scripts, bash scripts. Probably want to migrate that over to Ansible. So that might be on the list. We'll see. But we'll start with the existing shell script infrastructure. A lot of Debian. So, we're just apt-get installing and whatnot. But having a working infrastructure, deploying websites, and being able to point people who are interested in this podcast or the others or other projects to their home on the web rather than to a hosting, Anchor.fm or a Twitter account or an Instagram account. These are channels to reach people, but you want to pull people back to the home base so that they can interact and enjoy a platform that is purpose-built, even if it's just a blog, purpose-built for the project, not making use of the features of Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, right? So that's the goal. My sprint for the week, deploy those sites with real code, not hacking together and FTPing a tar file, something silly like that. So that's where I'll leave it. Thanks for listening. I hope to, like I said, enable some interactive chat and whether it's typing or guests, and to be able to interact about what projects you're working on, and whether you're interested in being a part of the Worky project or Casa Nunzia, or if you own a food truck, or if you're a mobile vendor in general, especially if you're not in Las Vegas. That's probably more interesting. Then that's an entirely different story for a different day. I thank you for listening, though, and I hope that my voice improves for a day or two between now and when allergy season returns with a vengeance in Las Vegas. And if you've never been to Las Vegas with allergies in the April-May timeframe, you're probably going to get an earful, and I will certainly have various noises, possibly tearing up eyes to share. So thank you again for listening, and I look forward to the end of the week where I tell you that my sprint was a ridiculous success, and I will start sending you to my main websites. Ciao, and by the way, stay safe, get vaccinated, wear a mask. Let's beat this thing. Thank you.